Okay, so this is our fourth 6 weeks review. There are 38 general topics, but each one is going to have, there's some stuff that kind of like bleed over in topics. And so, number one, these are things that we've talked about before. You know that there's the Columbian Exchange, and there's good and there's bad things about the Columbian Exchange. The worst thing about the Columbian Exchange is disease. Remember that disease is going to wipe out like 90% of some Native American population groups. Big contributors to that include smallpox. That was like one of the big ones. And in spite of the fact that there is terrible consequences of disease, there's something good. And the good is the different types of foods that move like all around. Like the foods that we mentioned by name are like corn and potatoes. And we've already talked about like potatoes before, like for the Irish, that's like a really big part for them because it can grow in the cold, super hard to mess up, it's super packed with calories. But there's also a new place where corn and potatoes helped out a lot. Africa. Like Africa lost 10 million people to the transatlantic slave trade, but after the and America lost 90% of their population, but after corn and potatoes starts going everywhere, the world population astronomically increased. So that is a good thing about the distribution of foods that were not available elsewhere. Another good thing about the Columbian Exchange was that Native American lives were changed forever by an animal that became like an essential for their way of life. What animal was that? The horse, right? Horses became like so important that Native Americans could not even imagine their life without a horse. And so there are terrible things about the Columbian Exchange, but there's also good things too. These different types of foods that help the world population rebound, and also practical things like the horse. Number two, it says castas. These are basically like racial subdivisions. Because when white people come over to America, you have these Spaniards, and they're going to have relationships with Native Americans, and they're going to have children with them. And so these castas are these racial groups. For example, we talked about if a white person and a Native American get together, what have they produced?
A mestizo.
A mestizo. If you have a white person and a black person, you have produced
a mulatto.
A mulatto. But then there's other combinations too. What happens if a mulatto and a mestizo get together? What happens if a mestizo and a Native American get together? What happens if a Native American and an African get? There's like 12 different subcategories. All those categories are called castas. And if we're going to rank them from like greatest to least, who do you think is on the top of that hierarchy?
White people.
White people. Those white Spaniards with unmixed blood. And to this day in Mexico, there are blonde-haired, blue-eyed, green-eyed Mexicans, and that indicates that they have that pure Spanish blood, that family line that is not mixed with anything. Those are called castas, and white Europeans were on the top of those social hierarchy. Kind of like the word caste when we think about the caste system of India, which also was based on color. Number three, we have a guy named de las Casas, and he was a Catholic priest, and he worked in the Americas, and he really cared for Native Americans, and he wanted to end something that was happening to Native Americans, the slave trade. And so he spoke out against these injustices. He fought for the rights of Native Americans, and that's good and all, but if we are going to make it illegal for Native Americans to be slaves, who are we going to start using all the more?
African Americans.
Well, yeah, Africans in general, right? Africans are going to be brought over as slaves. Black Africans, absolutely, they're going to be brought over as slaves. Because not all Africans are black. All of North Africa is Africa.
Is white.
But they're not black. Number four, transatlantic slavery. This was a big theme that we talked about. We watched all of Amistad. And one of the things about transatlantic slavery is that most slaves did not come to the United States. In fact, something like 5% or something came to the United States, but most of them went to two areas. What are two areas they went to?
Brazil.
And?
Indies.
The West Indies. Brazil and the West Indies.
There's a West?
And the reason, well, it's called the West Indies because remember Columbus came, he's like, oh, I must be in Asia. I'm going to call these brown-skinned people Indians because he thought he was in India. So he was wrong. And he called the islands he bumped into the Indies. Like, these are all in the region of India, but they're not. So to differentiate between the East Indies, the real islands that are out there near India, and where Columbus went, we call those the West Indies.
Okay.
Most slaves went to the West Indies and to Brazil, and they had to keep just sending slave ship after slave ship after slave ship, because what was happening to native... Exactly. So work conditions were so terrible that people were dying. And they thought, well, that's bad, but we'll just bring more slaves over. There was hard work conditions, there was disease, there was all these different things. And in the United States, we only had like 5% of all the slaves that came over to the United States. But you know what happened to the United States slave population?
It went up.
It grew naturally. And one reason for that is we have a more temperate climate. And so even though we only had 5% of all the slaves that came over, today 30% of all people in the African diaspora live in the United States because there was natural population growth. Number 5, the French had a role in America, and the French were a little bit different than the English because you know what the English did to Native Americans? They cleared the land. The English took land away. The English conquered Native Americans, but the French didn't care about any of that. The French did not want to kill the Native Americans, or they wanted to trade and do business. And that was one of the first things of 3 things the French did that were different, was that they traded. They didn't really want to conquer the Native Americans. They were more interested in trade than conquering. The French were. The second kind of thing about how the French... They definitely wanted to take their land. They wanted to, conquer them. They displaced them. The French didn't really care about any of that, conquering, displacing. They wanted just to do business. In fact, the main way that the French people made business was through trading for things like fur. There's a funny word in French. I don't speak French, so I'll probably mispronounce it, but it's called, I think, coureurs de bois, and it's a black lettered vocabulary word in your book. It means runners of the woods. These were like French guys who went out into the middle of nowhere in the woods to do business with Native Americans. I don't want to force you into anything. I don't want to kill you. I just want to do business with you. I'm willing to go out to where you live. Let's just be at peace and just make money with each other. The second thing about the French that was different was that there was not a lot of white French people that moved to America. Like Canada and Louisiana had almost 0 white people living in it. Most French people were not interested in leaving France to go move to Mississippi or Louisiana or, Canada. So there's actually very few people compared to like the English, which had big cities like Philadelphia and New York and Boston and Charleston. There wasn't a lot of French people who came. In fact, we'll see that later, that's a problem, because if there's not a lot of people in your empire in Canada, it's going to be really easy for people to take it over. And the third thing that was different was that the French are what religion? Specifically, they're Catholic, and there are some Catholic missionaries that come over. These missionaries are stereotypically the smartest Catholics you'll ever meet. They are the Jesuits. Number 3 for the French, they send Jesuit missionaries. These guys are so smart, they learn Native American languages. These guys are so smart, they can converse in Native American dialects, and they do come to try to spread Christianity. They're not trying to conquer and kill, but they do care about the Catholic Church enough to send the best, the Jesuits, who will, learn Native American languages to speak with them about the Catholic faith. 3 things about the French. Number 6, French and Indian War. So this is a war between France and Great Britain. And you know what Great Britain wants? More land. They want all of North America. They want Canada. And it turns out that's going to be not too hard for them because, as we already said, there weren't a lot of French people in Canada. So the British fight the French and the British win. Guess what the British get to take?
Land.
All of Canada. So Canada goes to the British. It's a super great thing for them. That's the French and Indian War. The British get Canada out of the deal. Number 7, speaking of fighting, there's other people who want to fight not for land, but just for their freedom and dignity. And there's something called the Stono Rebellion. Who's rebelling in that situation?
The slaves.
Slaves in South Carolina. And this is a rebellion that, like every slave rebellion pretty much fails. And this one's no different. But before it fails, what happened in record numbers?
They killed like
They killed the most white people of any other slave rebellion, and this freaked out white people. Yeah, it's like dozens, and we might not think, oh, that's terrible, like proportionally to like a war, but that was more than had ever happened before. And the Stono Rebellion caused white people to trust black people less afterward. The Stono Rebellion caused white people to actually treat their slaves worse as the result of this, thinking we cannot trust these people. They're not people that are trustworthy. You have to watch them. So it was a failure, and it actually led to slaves being treated worse. Number 8 is triangular trade. Sometimes it's called the Atlantic Circuit. A circuit is like a circle. Like when you study like physics, there's like an electric circuit. Because these 3 continents are all connected. All of this starts off with Europe, and what kind of goods are Europeans sending to Africa? Manufactured goods. There's things I can't make in Africa. A good specific example of a manufactured good would be guns, right? So we send these guns to Africa, and now that they're in Africa, we're going to get slaves, right? We're going to get African slaves. There's going to be one group of African elites that will conquer different tribes that speak different languages, bring them. They'll send them to America, and in the Americas, when I say Americas, like the West Indies, Brazil too, what's like one of the number one things they're going to grow? Sugar. Sugar's where all the money is, because all of us in this room, we like sugar. We probably couldn't go 20 days or 7 days without eating sugar, and actually when white people had sugar, they were hooked on it too. So they start producing sugar. Also, other raw materials produced in the New World, there's lumber, there's cotton, there's, just basic stuff like that they are sending back to Europe. And with those raw materials, they're making manufactured goods. You also make rum and things like that. It's an alcohol from sugar. And so these 3 places are all connected together. This is called triangular trade, sometimes called the Atlantic Circuit. The most infamous part of that triangular trade is the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage was that leg of the triangle from Africa to America, where 10 million Africans were sent across the Atlantic Ocean. Not all of them made it because of poor conditions on boats, because of disease, because of the cruelty of their masters. Some slaves were killed on the way. Sadly, their bodies were thrown off the boat and to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. That's the Middle Passage. Number 9, if I feel bad about owning a slave, but I say I love Jesus, that's okay. Because it turns out slave owners use the Bible to justify slavery. And there was a famous story that they opened up their Bibles to. It was the story of what famous guy? Noah. There's a famous story about Noah's sons, and he ends up cursing one of his sons. And white people looked at this and said, aha, this is where it says we can have slaves. Even though that passage doesn't talk about color, it doesn't talk about Africa, it doesn't say any of those things, white people said, right here, it's crystal clear, slavery is okay. Meanwhile, when slaves read and hear about Christianity, they get a very different impression than this is a religion of slavery. Instead, they find out that the Old Testament's main characters are a people who were enslaved in Africa. The Jews, people who've had it rough. And they say, well, we've had it rough too. And the whole main character of the Old Testament, the most famous guy is a guy named Moses, who famously frees slaves. So they say, wait a second, this book isn't about slavery being okay at all. It's about being freed from slavery. Moreover, they identify with this guy named Jesus. Though he's innocent, like the Africans saw they were, he suffered, like the Africans saw that they did. But even though this Jesus guy died, what makes it hopeful that there's a better tomorrow, if not a better today? He did die on the cross. That's terrible, but that's not hope. He rose from the dead. And Africans thought, man, this life might suck, but man, I'm going to be with Jesus one day, and that's going to be okay. On the handout, African coastal elites. You know who made a ridiculous amount of money in the slave trade?
Rival tribes.
Rich Africans did. There was these African coastal elites. They lived on the coast, and they made a ridiculous amount of money by going inland, 300 miles or so, capturing rival tribes, and then bringing them to white people. When slavery was made illegal, that was one of the saddest days in the world for African coastal elites, because they were making a lot of money by capturing other tribes. They would not have really seen this as, oh, I'm capturing a fellow African. There's not like a, quote, African identity, because I'm capturing someone from a different tribe. If you remember your world geography, human geography class in Rwanda, there's one country. Rwanda it's one of the smallest countries in all of Africa. But there's two tribes, they speak the same language. There's two tribes, they're basically the same religion. There's two tribes, and they hate each other. They're the Hutus and the Tutsis. Because they did not look at themselves as like, oh, we're all Rwandan, we all speak the same language, which they did. They were all Catholic, they all spoke the same language, but they said, you're totally different than me. It's okay for me to chop you with these, machetes that they did in those 100 days from April to July 4th. African coastal elites made a lot of money through slavery. We have a term called mercantilism. Mercantilism is this idea that you have a mother country. A mother country is like Great Britain or Spain, and they have colonies for one reason: to make money off of them. And I'm going to make money off of you a couple different ways. The mother country says to the colonies, number one, what am I going to get from these colonies in the middle of nowhere on the frontier? Raw materials. That could be cotton, that could be lumber, that could be sugar, and I'm going to get that raw material sold to me on the cheap. I'm going to send it back to me, and then I'm going to make those raw materials, that raw lumber, that sugar, whatever the case may be, into some sort of manufactured processed good. Now that I have these awesome manufactured processed goods that you can't make on your own, what am I going to do with some of that? Sell it back to you, raise the price up, and listen, you can't even shop around because I have required that there's something I get out of you. A monopoly. If the French knock on your door and say, I'll give you a better and cheaper price, I say, you're breaking the law, you're going to jail. I am forcing a monopoly. The mercantilist system is mother countries with colonies. You exist only to make me money. There's nothing you can do about it.
Tough.
Number 12, plantocracy. Plantocracy, you have these islands in the Caribbean, and they're ruled by a small minority of people. In fact, these islands are 90% black slaves, and then 10% of the islands are white. And then even then, a small minority of that 10% are the people who own the land and own the slaves. These societies, these islands run by white plantation owners, is called a plantocracy. Number 13, why slaves versus indentured servants? At first, all these islands had indentured servants. What color are indentured servants?
White.
But there's a lot of reasons why white people don't want to come to Cuba. White people don't want to come to the Bahamas and Puerto Rico. What's one reason based on the environment? Disease. I don't want to go to Cuba or Puerto Rico and die. I'm going to work 3 years, 4 years and not be free and then die. Instead, they say, I want to go somewhere more temperate, somewhere like Virginia. A second reason why indentured servants bail on the West Indies, even if I do end up making it, if I live on a small island, what's true of the price of land?
Expensive.
Super expensive. So even if I make it, I'm not going to be able to afford anything. Why did I come to America if I'm just working 4 years of my life just to own nothing? Virginia is really big. And because there's a lot of land, the prices are really cheap. The third reason why I pick a slave over an indentured servant, I only have an indentured servant 4 years and then they're free. That sucks. How many years can I get out of a slave? 7 to 8, I can literally double my time, my workforce. Because after that 7 to 8 years, what happens to an African slave on average?
They die.
They die. But hey, that's twice the amount of time as a white person. If I could double my productivity, why wouldn't you double your productivity? Sign me up for slaves instead of white people. Number 14. I live on an island in the West Indies. 90% of this island is black. 10% is white. There's no way in the world I can possibly enforce the rules, the quotas, the responsibilities. I'm going to need some help. So what I decide to do is I'm going to approach some of the privileged, intelligent, hardworking male slaves here, and I'm going to say this. I'm going to give you better food. I'm going to give you a better place to live. I'm going to take care of you, and your wife will never be separated. But what do you need to do for me?
Basically, help control the other slaves.
You need to help me control the other slaves. You need to be a driver, a privileged slave who helps discipline other slaves. And if you were told your family will be better, if you were told you'll have more food, better living conditions, but you might have to whip another slave, you're going to do that because actually, I might not even think this guy is like, oh, he's my fellow African. I don't even know what tribe that guy's from. All I know is that me whipping him means food is available for my family. Sign me up for that job. Those are called drivers. Number 15, the life expectancy. I told you that you could live 7 or 8 years. And I think there was an average age we said like a male slave would live. It was like 22 or 23 on average. Can you imagine why the time you hit 23, you've reached the age that the average person of your friends dies? Age 23. That's why they had to bring over another boat of African slaves and another and another and another. The average person, if you got to 23, you lived life. That was the average. Number 16, keeping slaves in order. I don't want my slaves to rebel, so there's a few things I want to do. There's some changes I want to have on them culturally. One change that's going to help them forget Africa, forget their old way, forget their old customs. I want to change what they believe. What would it be cool if they started to become? Christian. And so we're going to forbid them praying to their old gods, praying to their old statues. All that stuff is out. We're going to encourage Christianity, whether it's Protestant or Catholic. Now, some slaves are for sure excited and they become Christian. Other slaves are just doing the Catholic thing to keep their masters happy. What are they going to do when nobody's looking?
They're gonna worship their own religion.
They're going to worship their own religion. And if I'm Catholic, it's actually easier to do that because I could have a statue of the Virgin Mary, and you say it's Mary, and I could say it's Mary, but in my heart, I'm just going to pray to this statue of Virgin Mary as the mother goddess I worship back in Africa. Or if I have a Catholic saint that does whatever job, I'm going to say, oh yeah, that's Saint Anthony, or that's Saint whoever, but really in my heart, I think he represents African God from back home. There was a video on Brazil that almost no one watched, because there was a question I asked you on the quiz, give me another example other than voodoo about syncretism. And there was a video that was 4 minutes long that was not about voodoo, it was all about syncretism. And it showed you how it was a mix of African religion and Catholic religion, and how they even like had that temple and they would like hide the statues under the altar in that 4-minute video. I think like 3 people, maybe Jada was one of them, watched it maybe, but actually used that information on the quiz. That's good. That's good. Maybe 3 or 4 people mentioned that. Now, that's one thing, religion. That helps them forget Africa. What else will help them forget about Africa that I'm going to change about their culture? Their language. I'm going to make these African slaves start speaking English, start speaking French, Dutch, or Portuguese. And that is why there's no African American you know that when they call home for their ride in 30 minutes, they're going to ask for that ride from their mom in Mende. All those languages were beaten out of the slaves. And that helps because I don't want them talking about me. I don't want them planning. And I don't want them to remember what Africa was like. If you have your language, that could like have a sense of pride of what your culture was. That pride is gone. you're now going to be speaking English or another European language. Below that, it says manumission. Manumission is when you might save up money. Like you could do odd jobs. You could do extra work on Sundays or your off day. And slaves, if you were diligent, could actually save up money to buy what?
Their freedom.
Their freedom. Or let's say that your master had sex with you and you got pregnant. You know, any child of a slave is a slave. It can be kind of awkward to own my son. So sometimes women who were favored might get manumission, earn manumission. They might get their freedom. I think George Washington freed all of his slaves in his will. That does happen every once in a while. It happens a lot in Latin America. I think in Mexico, most black people in Mexico were free. In America, the U.S., it happens, but not nearly like in Latin America it happened. Yeah.
Actually, in George Washington's will, he said once his wife died, all of his slaves were free, but she went ahead and freed them because she was really paranoid that they were going to kill her.
Oh, well, there you go. Sometimes you have to be paranoid to do the right thing. It says this, Islamic slavery versus Atlantic slavery. There were some things that were overwhelmingly wrong in the quiz. Most people said Islamic slavery was all white people. Now, it is true that Muslims had white slaves, 1 million of them, but there. Well, it's,
I don't think I put whites only. I think I put like majority.
Well, it wasn't the majority.
Oh.
Now, they also, I think they took like 7 million Africans or 6 million Africans into slavery. But I definitely never said the majority.
Okay, but how I took it was like Islam was white slaves.
That was.
Atlantic was black.
So,
And that's how I split this up.
I
They
think
got
what I
split
did
by-
say, and I think
soldiers
what you
and
might
women.
recall is that for Islam, race was not a factor
Yeah.
on who's a slave. It was not, oh, you're white, so you're a slave. Race was not a factor, religion was a factor. And, well, gender will be a factor too. So for Muslims, race is not a factor, but they did enslave. In fact, Muslims were the first people to enslave millions of black people. They did do that. But there was different jobs that they gave their slaves. Soldiers were a job. Concubines were a job. The men who did get these jobs were often castrated. Those are 3 things that white people never did to their slaves. They never castrated their slaves. They never had open concubines. They never gave a black guy a gun and said, follow me into war in South Carolina. And what did white people do with their slaves?
They took them and then forced them into manual labor.
Manual labor, right? In the fields. That was the main thing that white transatlantic slavery did, was manual labor in the fields growing things like sugar. Atlantic slavery versus Islamic slavery. Number 19, cultural and demographic transformations. It turns out no one knows what the word demographics means.
Like land.
Demographics comes from the Greek word demos. We have a word called democracy. And in a monarchy, a king makes the decisions. And in a democracy, the demos make the decisions. The people make the decision. Demography talks about people. What are some changes in the people groups? Like, for example, if I say, what city is more demographically diverse? LaPorte, Texas, or Deer Park? Which one's more diverse? So the demographics of LaPorte has more African Americans and more Hispanics. So the question is asking, what ways was the demographics of the Americas changed? How were the people groups changed? Most people told me there was soil erosion and like soil exhaustion that was the number one answer from sophomores at LaPorte High School is demographics, soil exhaustion. It was just the land was tired.
About the transformations in America too. You
So
have to put the
demographics
disease in the-
talks about people. And the biggest transformation of people was 2 things: the depopulation of Native Americans due to disease, and the repopulation of those islands by black Africans. The demographic change was the depopulation of those islands of Native Americans because of disease, and the repopulation of those islands by black Africans. That's why if you and I go to Jamaica, there's no brown Native Americans in Jamaica anymore. It's 99% black. But there was not a single black Jamaican in 1492.
It's crazy to me.
That is a demographic change. Depopulation and then repopulation. It is weird to think about that. There's a cultural transformation. We kind of already talked about that. What religious cultural change happened to all those black Africans?
They were converted.
Converted to Christianity. Another cultural transformation is they started speaking white languages. That's a cultural transformation. Number 19. Number 20, we got a handout today about the average type of people went to New England versus Virginia. The average person went to New England was a person who had a family, the person who had a job, a person who was educated, a person who had money. These people who went to New England, people who were wealthy, people who had families, people who were educated, people who had jobs. A lot of times people like the Pilgrims, what did they come for in New England? What freedom did they want? They came for religious freedom. And I have the money to bring my entire family with me on this trip to New England. That's the kind of people that often went to New England. Educated. They came for religious freedom. They're often educated. If you're educated, you have a good job. If you have a good job, you've got money. And that means you get to go as a whole family. That was very different than the average person who went to a place like Virginia. In fact, there's a word, if I cannot afford my ticket to America, I will become what to pay off my ticket? Exactly. The average person who went to Virginia was a single guy with no job, no training, no future, that I'm willing to work for virtually nothing for 4 years just to earn a ticket to America that maybe the next 4 will be better than the last 4. There's a big difference in the average person who went to New England, educated, wealthy, a professional job, and the average person who went to New England, I'm an indentured servant with no skills, I'll be harvesting corn or tobacco. Joint stock company. This is where you have a company that you can buy shares in, because if you don't want to blow 100,000 of your personal funds, you can actually split up among many investors and you spread the risk out. So if the company doesn't work out, you haven't destroyed your own personal savings. And if it does well, we all can benefit. This allows for plantations in America when I live in France or I live in England. It allows for companies to do things they would have never been able to do before. It's a brand new thing. Corporations today are basically like that. This is an example of something we have today that has made more wealth than any other system on planet Earth. That's called capitalism. On the handout, Janissaries. These are slave soldiers where?
In the Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman Empire. These slave soldiers are a particular color. What are they?
White.
They are white. And these slave soldiers were also raised in what religion?
Christianity.
They were Christian. But I took them as children, as slaves. I put them into homes and raised them as Muslims. These are Janissaries. What made them so famous was that they were given a questionable piece of technology that people didn't fully trust. They were given guns. And at first, that's not a big deal, but as guns got better, the Janissaries became more important. And because they became more important, they started asking for more freedoms. They asked for and got the freedom to get married. They asked for and got the freedom to start what on the side? Businesses. And now that I got a wife and kids and and by the way, I can now pass it on. I actually don't even want to be free because I can pass on my janissary status to my son and he gets my business and he gets the sweet job and he gets the respect. But if I go to war, what might happen to me might happen to my business.
You may lose it because you die.
Might lose it all, so I might want to think about doing what? In a war. I'm probably going to hire a substitute, right? The bummer about that is I'm supposed to be like the best part of the Ottoman army, but now we have substitutes, and I love substitutes, but do substitutes have the same content level of knowledge as your core teachers do in math? No. They might be super sweet person, like, oh, that guy's super kind, she's really nice, but she doesn't know Algebra 2. She doesn't know geometry. They get substitutes. That's janissaries and changes. The Ottomans, you might remember the Ottomans, what major Christian city did they take over?
Constantinople.
There was a major Christian city called Constantinople. And what empire was that the capital of that they destroyed?
Rome.
Different name, not Rome. The
Byzantine.
Byzantine Empire. That Byzantine Empire was around for a long time. It went away in 1453. You might remember beautiful Constantinople even got a name change. It's called Istanbul. And those churches that once filled Constantinople, they turned them into what?
Mosques.
They turned them to mosques. Number 24. The Ottomans have a rival. They're both Muslims, but they don't like each other. Who's the rival of the Ottoman Empire? The Safavids. Now, there's also another country that they have a frenemy relationship with.
Russia.
The Ottomans are enemies, rivals, but also friends in the sense of we do business with you. There were some white people that lived right next to the Ottoman Empire. No, white people, white Europeans that lived on the coast. And these white Europeans became famous for being middlemen. The Italians. Where it says trade partners, there was the Italians were trade partners and even frenemies with the Ottomans. And you might remember that they went and brought coffee to Europe and sugar to Europe and spices to Europe. The Italians did. But they did what to the price?
They raised it.
And they made so much money they were able to finance
The
the Renaissance. And that's fun and all, but that super pissed off the Portuguese and super pissed off the Spanish, who said, I think I'll just sail around Africa and get there myself. And when they finally figure out how to get to around Africa and to India, the Italians are kind of out of luck. Because who's going to pay extra when I can just go get it myself for half off?
But it's a longer route.
Even though it's longer, it's cheaper just to sail in a boat all the way around Africa, get to India, and come back. Still cheaper than going through the Italians. Still cheaper than going through those Italians. And that's why Italy kind of like peaks out in the Renaissance. And then after that, when do you ever hear about Italy again? Like, oh, watch out, Italy, said no one ever, right? Their show is over. Just like people that you know that peak in high school, they're like, man, I would have gone to state in football, you know? And like, you probably would not have gone to state in football. Below that, it says rivals. It says the 25 collective weakness of these land-based empires. What did those three Muslim empires, the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals, not focus
the
on?
naval force.
They didn't have really strong. There was three Muslim empires: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughal. All three were land-based empires, and all three did not focus on, did not invest in, did not think a navy would be the most important thing. But in case you've missed it, for the last 200 years, 15, 16, 1700s, you know who the winners are in Europe? countries with really great navies, like Portugal, like the Netherlands, even small countries like England, Netherlands, Portugal, they're teeny tiny, but they're the most important on the planet because they've got good navies. They have ocean-based empires, these sea-based empires. Number 26, the Devshirme. This was the system of enslaving white Christians. This is the system of enslaving white Christians. This was when the Ottomans would take kids who are 9 years old, 10 years old, and you're training them to be Janissaries. And what happens to these white Christian kids if you're not going to be with your mom and dad and now you're living in a Muslim home? What change is probably just going to happen? You're going to change religion. You're going to become a Muslim, right? Because how hard is it going to be for you to stay true to the faith when you're not around Christians anymore? The Devshirme is that slave system of taking white kids, Slavic kids, into slavery to become Janissaries. 27. There is a similar theme that the Ottomans and the Safavids have economic problems. Someone on the planet is causing an economic problem that has rippled out to everyone, a problem of inflation. Who can we blame for inflation? The Spanish, because they've got a ridiculous amount of what that they are spending? Silver. And they're spending billions of dollars or billions equivalents of silver, and it's actually caused global inflation, destroying the Ottoman and the Safavids. Not only did they screw up their own economy, but they screwed up other countries all around the planet. Thanks, Spain. One reason they messed up so bad, who did they kick out that were really good at numbers? The Jews, who had served as traditional bankers after 1492. Number 28. There are some rich people in the Ottoman Empire. You know, rich people collect weird stuff. And the rich people of the Ottoman Empire, what did they collect?
Tulips.
Tulips. These tulips were so expensive, it was like the equivalent of buying 22 oxen. And that's like a lot of money to blow on a flower. And so a lot of average, normal, regular, traditional Muslims looked at their leaders and said, you guys are ridiculous. Our country's falling apart and you're wasting money on a flower from Europe? You know what? We probably shouldn't be copying white Europeans who are Christian. You know what book we should probably be reading? And you know who we should follow the example of more instead of random white Christians?
Muhammad and the Quran.
Muhammad and the Quran. Why are we copying white people? We are the ones with the only true religion. People got so upset. Traditional Muslims, they rose up against their leaders in what's called the Patrona Halil Rebellion. They were fed up with it. There's a group of people called the Wahhabis that rise up, and they said, we need to read the Quran literally to the ruling class. They rose up.
What was the battle called?
Patrona Halil Rebellion.
Okay.
29, we already talked about the Ottomans have a rival, the Safavids. Why were they rivals? Two reasons I can think of. One,
Different, denominations.
yeah, what are the Safavids?
Shia.
Shias. They believe in Ali and Hussein and the hidden Imam coming back at the end. What is going on with that? Said Sunnis. They're Safavid, and there's a second thing wrong with the Safavids. What do they not do that the rest of the Muslim world pretty much does? They were Islamized, but the Safavids were never
The Arabized.
Arabized. What do they speak there in the Safavid Empire?
Persian.
Persian. They never signed on with Team Arabic speakers. They are Shias, and they don't even speak Arabic. Are they even Muslim? They would ask. We talked about Arabization and Islamization. Almost everyone gave up their local language to speak Arabic. Almost everyone gave up their local religion, like most, but not all, Christians in Egypt. And there's a parallel. What is another country that caused their language and their religion to replace native languages and native religions? The what? Give me a conquering nation.
Russia.
Just like the Arabs,
Russia.
The Spanish is a good example. You could probably even argue Russia, because today we said that Russia Christianized those Asiatic people. But Spain is a great example, because they create a huge empire, and there's way more people who speak Spanish outside of Spain than live inside of Spain.
30.
30 is Arabization, Islamization, and the parallel.
Okay.
31 characteristics of Shiism. They love Ali. They love Hussein. And they believe there is a 12th Imam coming back when?
At the end of the world.
End of the world. So stay tuned for that.
Is this 31?
That's characteristics of Shiism. There's Ali, is super important. There's Hussein. He's the guy that I honor by whipping myself, in parades, We watch the video. It's a beautiful thing. Their culture, it's important. 32, women in Islamic law. Women have to be what for modesty? Covered. We're not going to let them go out in public because the ladies are only looking for opportunities they might think to cheat, or we just want to protect our women. So women are covered. They rarely go out in public, but there's a really cool thing Islamic law says about a right women have. They can own property. And you might also end up getting married at a young age, would not be unusual. Islam and same-sex behavior. Officially, homosexuality is illegal, but there's some things that I don't count as being gay. There are things called beardless boys. These sexual relationships with beardless boys, it's not unusual, and it's not hidden. And if you were to say, doesn't the Quran say homosexuality is wrong? They would say, yes it does, but I am not gay. Because when this boy grows up, you're never going to sleep with that boy ever again.
But that's not what?
I am not saying that makes sense. I'm not saying that all Muslims agree. I am saying it was done openly. They did not hide it. They did not pretend it was something different. They stood and smiled for a picture that I showed you in Uzbekistan. And in the video I showed you from PBS, they asked that man, are you going to have sex with this boy? He said, of course. Akbar is in the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is kind of different because it's in India. And what is the majority religion in India?
Hinduism.
They're Hindus. This is different because this is a country that is a Hindu majority ruled by a Muslim minority. Right? That's what makes the Mughals different. And there's some tension. In fact, early on, those Muslims break.
Wait, ruled by what?
It was a Hindu majority ruled by a Muslim minority. There's some tension. In fact, when they take over India, guess what they do to some of those Hindu temples with hundreds of gods and statues?
They knock them down.
They burn them down. And so Akbar comes along, and he wants to chill things down a little bit. He wants the tension to go down. So Akbar, he invites Christians to work with him, Hindus to work with him, everyone to work with him. And then Akbar even goes farther. Akbar even is okay claiming he's who?
God.
God. And he also makes his own religion, because Allah Akbar can also mean not only God is great, but it can mean God is Akbar, and that's him. So he says, yeah, that sounds good. Allah Akbar means God is great, and that's a very common, just like Christians might say hallelujah. Hallelujah means praise the Lord. That's what it means in Hebrew. And we say it all the time. Even atheist kids say, oh, there's no test tomorrow. Hallelujah. They're saying literally praise God is what they're saying in Hebrew. That's what, you've never heard anyone say hallelujah? Oh, okay. Well, now you know. And knowing's half the battle. It says, the fall of the Mughals, that's so good. I'm just going to let you look it up on page 538, I think. 36, Moscow. What is the official religion of Moscow? of Russia, the
Orthodox.
Orthodox Church. They pushed the Orthodox religion. In fact, they claim to be the third what? Yeah, the third Rome was the nickname. Because you might remember the second Rome was Constantinople and it fell in 1453. They say, oh, we're the third one. And the rest of Europe's like, yeah, you're not even anywhere near that. The Cossacks vocabulary word, let you look it up. Finally, our friend Peter the Great. He knew that Russia was backwards compared to the rest of Europe. So he said, you know what I need to do? I need to westernize Russia. And by the way, I need a warm water port. I need a warm water port because what's true of like thousands of miles of Russia's coast?
It's frozen.
It's frozen, right? And that's not good because all the cool kids have navies and warm water. His first thing he tries is to try to take over the Black Sea. He has to fight the Ottomans. It works out okay, but doesn't really get it. But he does succeed by going to war with Sweden. And by beating up Sweden, he gets access to a body of water northwest of Russia. What is that body of water called?
The Baltic Sea.
The Baltic Sea. Now, it's not like a huge thing. It's relatively small. It's not like an open door to the rest of the world, but it's definitely a window. And this was his window to the west. And he decides to move what? On this land he takes over from Sweden.
The capital,
And he decides to name this capital after someone super cool,
St. Petersburg.
himself. He calls it St. Petersburg. And he decides, if we're moving to a new capital, forget Russian architecture because no one respects us. Forget Russian ways of building things because people think we're trash white people. Who will we copy?
The French.
The French, because they're like on their A game at this time. Everyone loves the French. They respect the French. In fact, the one palace everyone thinks is the best, Versailles. And in class, Versailles is like the palace, and they try to look like Versailles. He tries to modernize. He tries to westernize because he wants to be like Western Europe. He even tells his men, if we want to look like Europeans, what do we need to get rid of?
Our beard.
Our beards. Shave them. They're gone. We are westernizing. All right?